Here's something that happens inside you when you're ready to stop settling. And it's not what you think. It's not about suddenly finding the perfect person or fixing your circumstances. It's about recognizing that quiet voice that's been whispering, "This isn't actually what I want," finally getting loud enough that you can't ignore it anymore. You know that feeling when you realize you've been accepting less, not because it's all that's available, but because somewhere along the way, you convinced yourself it was all you deserved. 3 months into defending a relationship that's slowly draining you, something shifts. The moment you realize you're spending more energy explaining why you stay than you do actually enjoying the experience. It happens quietly at first. That subtle exhaustion that creeps in when someone asks, "How are things going?" And you catch yourself launching into the same rehearsed explanation about why it's complicated, why they don't understand the whole picture, why it's actually fine despite what it looks like from the outside. This is the exhaustion signal. It's not about dating culture or generational trends. It's about that personal moment when your internal defense system starts malfunctioning, when the stories you tell yourself to justify staying begin requiring more creativity than the situation actually deserves. You know you've hit this point when you find yourself mentally preparing for conversations about your life, crafting explanations for why you're still in that job, that relationship, that living situation, that pattern that everyone else can see isn't serving you. The energy it takes to make it sound reasonable to others becomes a mirror for how unreasonable it started to feel to you. There's something almost violent about the moment you recognize your own voice making excuses. Not the gentle kind of understanding or patience, but the desperate, grasping kind of justification that sounds hollow even as it leaves your mouth. That's when you know you're not defending a choice anymore. You're defending against the growing awareness that you've been settling for something that requires constant explanation to make sense. But 6 months into that same pattern, something even more telling happens. The opinions that used to matter, the ones that kept you analysing every conversation, every facial expression, every delayed text response, start feeling strangely distant. Not because you've become indifferent to people, but because you've started hearing your own voice more clearly than the imagined chorus of judgment that used to run the show. You catch yourself in moments where disapproval, something that would have sent you spiraling just months before, barely registers as more than background noise. Not because you've stopped caring about relationships, but because you've finally started distinguishing between genuine connection and the exhausting performance of being who you think others need you to be. The shift happens quietly at first. That over-reliance on others' approval that once felt essential starts feeling more like a weight you're tired of carrying. You notice yourself making decisions without the usual internal committee meeting where you imagine what everyone else would think, choosing the restaurant you actually want to try instead of the safe option everyone else would approve of, saying no to plans that drain you without crafting an elaborate explanation that makes your choice sound reasonable to people who weren't even asking for one. There's something almost revolutionary about the moment you realize you've been prioritizing others' needs over your own, not out of love, but out of a desperate need for validation. The people-pleasing voice that used to whisper, "What will they think?" starts getting drowned out by a quieter but more persistent question. What do I actually want here? When other people's opinions lose their grip, you're not losing your capacity for empathy. You're gaining the ability to choose your responses from a place of what actually feels right in your body, not from fear. Have you ever caught yourself making excuses for something that deep down you know isn't working? Comment your answer below. Now let's talk about what happens when that exhaustion finally breaks. You begin seeing yourself differently, not just in the moment, but projected forward. The ability to clearly envision who you want to become starts crystallizing in a way it never has before. It's not about having all the answers or some perfect 5-year plan. It's about that subtle shift where your future self stops feeling like a stranger and starts feeling like someone you're actively becoming. You know you've hit this turning point when you can picture yourself making different choices without it feeling impossible or foreign. Not the desperate fantasy version of yourself that requires a complete personality transplant, but the version that's just a few degrees different from who you are now. More boundaries, less apologizing, clearer about what you actually want. This future self isn't a stranger living in some distant time. They're you, with more experience, clarity, and perspective, having weathered the storms you're currently facing. When you can access that version of yourself, something shifts in your decision-making. The gap between who you are now and who you're becoming starts feeling navigable instead of impossible. This is when you stop asking, what would everyone else think if I left this situation? And start asking, what would the version of me who's learned to honour what I want actually do here? The future self becomes less of a distant aspiration and more of a trusted advisor who's already figured out how to live differently. You're not trying to become someone else. You're finally becoming yourself without all the layers of settling that convinced you this was as good as it gets. But then something deeper happens. Something that feels almost rebellious. You start questioning the fundamental assumption that you need anyone else's permission to want more. Not their approval, not their understanding, not their blessing, their permission. It's the quiet realization that you've been waiting for some external authority to validate that yes, you're allowed to be dissatisfied with something that looks fine from the outside. You catch yourself mid-explanation to a friend about why you're considering leaving that job, that relationship, that living situation. And you realize you're not actually seeking their advice. You're seeking their permission. Permission to trust your own instincts. Permission to believe that your internal experience matters more than how things appear to everyone else. Permission to change your mind about what you thought you wanted. There's something almost shocking about the moment you understand that changing your mind isn't betrayal, it's growth. That outgrowing a situation you once chose doesn't make you flighty or ungrateful. It makes you human. The version of you who accepted that job, entered that relationship, signed that lease. They made the best decision they could with the information and self-awareness they had at the time. But you're not that person anymore. And the quiet revolution begins when you stop apologizing for having evolved. When you stop treating your expanded sense of what you want as something that requires external validation or consensus. The moment you realize you're allowed to want more, not because anyone else thinks you should, but because you finally started listening to that voice that's been whispering the truth all along. And that's when the most profound shift happens. You stop asking, what will happen if I leave? And start asking, what's happening to me if I stay? The question flips. Instead of catastrophizing about the unknown future, you start getting honest about the cost of the known present. The energy you've been spending managing other people's potential reactions starts flowing back toward understanding your own actual experience. You realize the thing you've been most afraid of, disappointing people, being misunderstood, that having to explain yourself, has already been happening. You've been living in a constant state of preemptive damage control, trying to manage perceptions of choices you haven't even made yet. The fear of judgment that kept you frozen was just fear of making visible what was already true, that you've outgrown this situation. There's something almost laughable about the moment you recognize that staying to avoid other people's discomfort has become your primary source of discomfort. You've been protecting everyone else from the inconvenience of your growth or slowly suffocating under the weight of your own unexpressed truth. The people whose opinions you've been trying to manage probably aren't even thinking about your situation as much as you imagine they are. When you finally stop settling, it's not because you've become demanding or difficult. It's because you've remembered that your internal experience matters as much as anyone else's external comfort. Honoring what you want isn't selfish. It's the only honest choice left. The version of you that stays out of obligation isn't actually serving anyone well. You're not giving your best self to relationships, work, or situations that require you to shrink. you're giving a diminished version who's learned to make peace with less than what feels right. The quiet revolution isn't about changing everything at once. It's about finally trusting that voice that's been whispering the truth all along. And once you start, listeners,